Armies throughout history have needed shelter. During war in Europe's medieval period, troops sought refuge in castles, billeted in towns and villages, or camped in the field. Typically, these forces were small and disbanded after a single campaign, making housing only a temporary burden among generals' responsibilities. Soldiers' shelter arose as a distinct problem for European authorities with the advent of standing armies during the 17th and 18th centuries. As part of what historians term the military revolution, European states began to raise larger forces of long-term troops who stayed under arms permanently. Consequently, sovereigns from the 17th century onward had to address the problems of health and housing for their men year-round. In the early days of standing armies, leaders relied on billeting soldiers in public and private buildings, a method supplanted by temporary camps. During the early 17th century, civilians had most commonly borne the burden of providing housing for armies at home and on campaign. Between battles, troops most frequently lodged in homes, barns, and public buildings in the towns and villages as they traveled, easily doubling the area's population. This scenario usually created difficulties, as the increased concentration of human bodies spread disease, undermined soldiers' discipline, antagonized civilians, and overburdened housing stock. During the 18th century, officers reined in their soldiers and mitigated their impact on civilian populations. The widespread implementation of drill and a rising proportion of officers to men made armies more disciplined and therefore less prone to violence and plunder against non-combatants. Shifting cultural values that began emphasizing restraint and order also helped to curtail depredations as rulers instituted codes of conduct for their men, while newly created military courts punished violators. The decline of religious motivations in warfare reduced antagonisms between soldiers and inhabitants, even when armies occupied enemy territory. Finally, as commanders wanted to maintain discipline and effectiveness, they sought to reduce prolonged contact with civilian populations. Therefore, fewer soldiers found themselves billeted in towns during the 18th century. As soldiers' numbers increased and enlistment terms lengthened, governments sought alternatives. During the late 17th century and through the 18th century, European states embarked on expensive programs of barracks construction. France, Prussia, and Austria all erected permanent structures to lodge soldiers on home soil. During wartime, these same structures housed soldiers and their supplies as they marshaled to depart for active theaters. France erected barracks and fortresses along its western frontier and used them as jumping-off points for campaigns in Germany and the Low Countries. Barracks and forts in Prussian and Austrian territory fulfilled a similar purpose for those states, although there were fewer of them than in France. Thus, developments in military housing contributed to new infrastructure that increasingly undergirded regular armies' operations in the 18th century. In the field, more active central governments made their greatest impact on shelter by supplying armies with larger numbers of tents. Prior to the 18th century, tents remained too few in number to cover sizable armies on campaign. During and immediately after the 30 Years' War, 1618 through 1648, in France, when billets in towns were unavailable, soldiers commonly sheltered each night in hastily built brush huts. While these huts presented no financial burden to army or state, they suffered from leaks and drafts and depended on locally available supplies. The steadily growing standing armies of the later 17th and 18th centuries sought more reliable campaign housing. Consequently, through the latter years of Louis XIV's reign, French troops discontinued the use of huts as their preferred temporary lodging and opted instead for tents.